Dark stone walls, a single torch, the sound of footsteps, echoing. This isn't a battlefield. There's no war here, only one chair, one question, and one answer. That must be given. But what if the truth doesn't come? What if silence stays? That's when the tools appear, not machines of war, but of warning, simple, cruel, precise. They didn't kill quickly, they didn't shout, they whispered, and their whispers were heard all across history. Because in the darkest corners of the medieval world, justice didn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wore iron, sometimes it had teeth, and sometimes it smiled. These were not tools for healing. They were not made by kind hands. They were made to break, to bend the body, to steel the will, to make people talk, or make them wish they had. And so we ask, how far would they go to make someone confess? How deep could pain reach before a soul gave in? These are the questions we'll explore. Through iron spikes, through fire and ropes, through silence and screams. This is not just history. This is a journey into the cold rooms where truth was taken, into the devices that waited patiently, into the minds of those who designed pain with purpose. So as you listen, stay quiet, stay still. Let the past speak. Because these were not just tools, they were messages, and tonight they speak again. You've made it here, and that already says something. Before we step deeper into the shadows of history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if this quiet journey feels right to you. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet comfort seeing how many of us are scattered across the world, yet sharing this moment together. Now, dim the lights, let the room settle, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and as the past slowly unfolds, allow yourself to drift, one whisper at a time. The room is quiet now. Stone walls. A single torch flickers in the corner, casting long shadows. In the center of the chamber stands a figure, tall, dark, and unmoving, shaped like a human, shaped like a coffin. But this is not a place of rest. This is the Iron Maiden. It looks almost peaceful at first, crafted to resemble a woman, her face carved with calm, her arms folded in silence. Some had delicate features, others grotesque expressions, but all shared one hidden secret, what lay inside. The Iron Maiden opens slowly, hinges grown with age, and as the doors part, a mouth of metal reveals its truth. Rows of iron spikes, not sharpened like swords, but long, slender, and precisely placed, one by the chest, another near the eye, more along the legs, the stomach, the back. They weren't meant to kill instantly. They were arranged to avoid vital organs, not for mercy, but for endurance. The victim would be placed standing inside. The doors would close, not slammed, not forced, just slowly shut. The spikes would press inward, not to impale fully, but to pierce just enough. Blood would begin to drip, breathing would become harder, and in the darkness of that metal chamber the only sound would be the heartbeat of the one trapped within, or so the stories say. Because the Iron Maiden is also a mystery. For centuries it has been shown as a symbol of medieval cruelty. Museums have displayed replicas, paintings have imagined it, writers have whispered of it in old books. But when historians began to ask deeper questions, the truth grew more complicated. There are no solid records of the Iron Maiden being used in the Middle Ages, no trials that mention it, no letters from guards, no first-hand accounts. The earliest physical versions seem to appear in the 18th or 19th century, long after the Middle Ages ended. Could it be that the Iron Maiden was never truly used? Some believe it was a creation of fear, a theatrical invention, a warning more than a weapon, something built to shock the viewer, not to harm the body. Others think it may have existed in secret, far from courts and castles, perhaps in the quiet corners of dungeons that left no records behind. And yet, the image stayed with us. Why? Because the Iron Maiden was never just about death. It was about control. The victim stood, alone, upright, surrounded by darkness. Every movement led to pain. Every breath risked a wound. The body could not collapse. It could only endure. And outside that chamber, someone always stood with the key. Imagine that moment, the prisoner waiting inside, the door still ajar, not yet shut, not yet decided, the final look shared with the one who held power, and then the sound of metal closing, slowly, inevitably. In that silence, power speaks loudest, and that is the strange power of the Iron Maiden's legend. Even if it was never used, it still works. Its very shape creates fear. Its story lingers in our minds, not because it shows violence, but because it suggests what violence could become, hidden, quiet, patient, just like the Iron Maiden itself. In later years, the device found its way into books, horror films, and dark museums, a symbol of medieval cruelty, even if misplaced. People lined up to see it, to shudder at it, to wonder what it must have felt like to be inside. But no one truly knows, and maybe that's what gives it its lasting chill. Not what it did, but what it might have done. It is a reminder that in every age people have built things, not just to harm, but to terrify, sometimes with fire, sometimes with sound, and sometimes with silence. The Iron Maiden does not scream, it does not bleed, it waits, calm, empty, until someone chooses to use it. And as we leave this chapter, its doors slowly close again. The spikes rest, untouched. The chamber returns to quiet. But somewhere in the cold of history, it still stands. Waiting, the Iron Maiden rests now, its doors closed, its silence complete. But not all devices were made to enclose the body. Some were made to stretch it, to pull it, to test the very limits of bone and skin. And so we move deeper to a longer table, wooden, simple. At first glance it could be mistaken for a bed or a workbench, but the handles on either end reveal its purpose. Heavy rollers connected by ropes, a wheel at one side, and in the middle, space for a human form. This is the rack. One of the oldest known torture devices in Europe. Its design was basic. 2 ends, one fixed, one that turned. A victim was tied by the wrists at one end and the ankles at the other. Then, with each gentle turn of the wheel, the body was pulled, inch by inch, slowly, steadily. There was no sudden snap, just tension, gradual, growing. At first, it felt like a stretch, nothing more. The body naturally adjusts, resists, muscles tighten, breath quickens. But the rack was not in a hurry. It worked in silence. One turn, then another. Soon the shoulders begin to shift, the arms strain, the tendons in the legs pull tight, like ropes about to snap, and still the wheel turns. In time, joints begin to separate. Shoulders dislocate first, then elbows, knees, hips. The victim remains conscious, wide awake, as their limbs are slowly pulled out of place, not broken, not crushed, simply undone. There are no blades, no blood, only the soft tearing of tissue, only the whisper of ropes being pulled. The rack had a purpose beyond pain. It was often used to extract information, confessions, names, secrets. With each question asked, the wheel would turn, one more time, a little further, and if the victim still held back, the wheel would turn again and again. In some cases, the rack was turned until the arms were pulled entirely out of their sockets. The spine would begin to arch unnaturally. The chest would tighten, making it harder to breathe. And when the torment finally stopped, the person was no longer whole. Even if they survived, they rarely walked again or moved the same. What made the rack so feared was its control. It didn't rely on chaos, it didn't shout or scream. It was quiet, mechanical, cold. Every movement was planned, every turn counted. It wasn't emotional, it didn't get angry, it simply pulled. And that's what made it terrifying. Unlike the Iron Maiden, the rack left marks that were visible. Arms twisted the wrong way, legs that could no longer hold weight. Sometimes the body was left permanently crooked, bent by design, not by chance. It was used across Europe, in castles, dungeons, courts. Both church and state used it, sometimes under the name the Duke of Exeter's daughter, a name used during medieval England, but its structure stayed the same. A table, ropes, a wheel, and time. Always time. The longer it continued, the deeper the damage. There was no safe point, no warning before things became irreversible. A single extra turn could mean the difference between life and death, or between walking again and never standing. And that was the power behind it. It offered a choice: talk or stretch, confess or endure. And many did talk, some truthfully, others not. Under pain like that, the mind becomes confused. Memories twist, just like joints. Some victims confess to crimes they never committed, just to make it stop, just to breathe again without screaming. Today, few original racks survive. Most were broken apart, lost, or destroyed. Some replicas sit in museums, but even when empty, they seem to echo with something, a weight, not just of the people who once lay on them, but of the silence they held, the silence of control. Because that's what the rack was built for, not chaos, but order, the slow, careful breaking of a human being, one pull at a time. Now we leave this room. The wheel stops turning, the ropes go still, and the wooden frame, once alive with tension, rests in silence once more. But the thought of it lingers. What would it feel like to be stretched, to feel yourself separating, not in one quick strike, but by degrees, not torn, but undone? That's the horror of the rack. It doesn't scream, it waits. And when it begins, it never rushes. The rack lies still now. Its ropes no longer stretched, its wheel no longer turning, but the feeling it leaves behind of slow, precise pain stays with us. And from the wide wooden table, we now turn to something small, something quiet. It fits in the palm of a hand, cold, made of metal. At first glance, it looks almost beautiful, like a fruit or a flower waiting to open. This is the pear of anguish, a device unlike the others. It wasn't built for display. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't tear limbs or spill blood in open view. Instead, it worked in secret, deep inside the body. Its shape was simple, a metal bulb, divided into 4 curved sections. At its base, a screw mechanism. When turned, the sections opened, slowly spreading outward like the petals of a blooming flower. But this flower did not open in the sunlight, it bloomed in darkness. The pear of anguish was placed inside the body, through the mouth, the rectum, or in women, the vaginal canal. Once inserted, the screw at the base would be turned. Bit by bit, the device would open from within, pressing outward in every direction. There were no screams at first, no wild movements, only discomfort, a strange fullness. But as the turning continued, the pressure built, tissue stretched, muscles tore, internal bleeding often followed. The pain was intense and deeply personal. There was no crowd to witness it, no grand display. This was punishment meant for shame, for control, and for silence. Some historians believe it was used on those accused of lying, blasphemy, or even homosexuality. Others say it targeted women accused of witchcraft or adultery. But whatever the reason, the message was the same: hurt them where no one could see, break them from the inside out. And so this small tool, so easy to carry, so easy to hide, became a weapon of fear. In some designs, spikes were added to the petals, so when the device opened, it didn't just stretch tissue, it shredded it, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The person on the outside might seem calm, still, even seated, but inside they were falling apart. The use of the pair was rarely public. Unlike the rack or the Iron Maiden, this was not for crowds. It was for prisons, dungeons, interrogation chambers where there were no witnesses, only the victim and the torturer. Some versions were engraved, decorated, as if to mask their true purpose, a cruel contrast, beauty hiding destruction. And once it had done its job, the device could be closed again, cleaned, hidden, reused. No trace left behind but the pain. There are debates among historians. Some believe the pair was not widely used. Others say it may have been more symbolic than practical. But even if it was rare, the fear it inspired was real. The idea that something so small, so silent, could do so much damage stayed with people. And in many ways, that made it more terrifying than larger devices. You could walk past it on a table and never know. You could see it in someone's hand and not feel afraid until you understood what it did. It didn't stretch the body like the rack. It didn't pierce the flesh like the Iron Maiden. It simply opened. And that was enough. What made the pair of anguish so unique was the feeling of betrayal it carried. It entered gently. It caused no harm at first. But once it began to bloom, there was no going back. The pain was hidden. The wounds were inside. The silence was complete. Today, replicas of the device sit behind glass. People stare at them, trying to understand. Some believe they were used only in legends. Others believe they were very real, and that we'll never truly know how many were harmed by them. But whether myth or memory, the image of the pair remains clear. A blossom that never opened for beauty, only for pain. And so we leave it now, closed once more, quiet on the table. But its story lingers, reminding us that not all horror comes with noise. Some of it comes in silence. Just as the Iron Maiden closed with a whisper, just as the rack pulled with patience, the pair of anguish bloomed and broke its victims from within. The pair of anguish closed quietly behind us. Its silence, its cold precision, left a mark not just on the body, but on the mind. And now we step into a different kind of pain, one louder, one made to last, not hidden in the dark, but placed right out in the open. This is the breaking wheel. It was large, circular, a wooden wheel, much like the kind once used on carts, but this one didn't roll across fields. It didn't carry goods or grain. It carried pain. Also known as the Catherine wheel, it stood upright at times, or was laid flat on the ground, and on it a body was tied. Arms stretched across the spokes, legs bound tightly, sometimes face up, sometimes down, always exposed. Then came the hammer. The executioner would approach with a heavy iron bar or mallet, not to end a life quickly, but to bend it, break it, reshape the human body into something unrecognizable. Blows were delivered to the limbs, not just once, but again and again. Each strike had a target: the upper arms, the thighs, the shins, the forearms, carefully chosen, meant not to kill, but to shatter bones without damaging vital organs. The goal was simple and cruel: to keep the person alive, but broken, Arms twisted the wrong way, legs bent where they shouldn't. The body became a map of unnatural shapes. There was an order to it, a method. Some wheels even had markings to guide where each strike should land. Precision, once again, in service of pain. The first few blows brought screams, the next brought silence, a silence that didn't mean the person was gone, but that they had entered another place entirely, a world of pain so deep no words could follow, and after the breaking was complete, the wheel itself became the prison. The shattered body was woven between the spokes, threaded through like a rope, arms and legs looped in and out, left there twisted and helpless. The wheel was then raised, lifted, onto a post, or placed upright where others could see. This wasn't just punishment, it was a message, a warning to anyone who passed. This is what happens to traitors, to thieves, to rebels. Sometimes the victim was left there for days, alive, slowly dying. Other times they were already gone, but their broken forms stayed as a kind of public memory. In some cases mercy was offered, a final blow, called the coup de grâce, to the chest or neck, quick, final, but that was rare. Mercy didn't come easily on the wheel. The wind would blow, the birds would gather, time would pass, and still the wheel stood, unlike the pear, which worked inside, or the Iron Maiden, which closed in shadows. The breaking wheel did its work under the open sky. It turned punishment into a kind of theatre, a display, something for the crowd to see and remember. And perhaps that's what made it so haunting, because the body, once upright and whole, was now a broken shape, bent and silent, still tied to something that once moved, but now only held stillness. In some regions the wheel was used with fire. The broken body was placed above flames, slowly burned while still alive. In others, it was part of festivals, where justice was made public, loud and final. The wheel didn't whisper, it roared. Even when silent, it carried a voice, one made of wood, bone, and memory. Historians today study its many forms. In France, in Germany, across Europe, different names, same purpose. A tool not just to punish, but to make an example. And yet, there's something deeply human about the horror it brings. We look at the wheel, and we don't just see pain, we see the fear of being broken, of losing control, of being reshaped against our will. The body was once whole, now it is not, and that image stays with us. Today, pieces of the breaking wheel remain in museums, rusted metal, cracked wood, but the fear it once carried, that's still sharp, and so we leave it here, standing tall, silent in the wind. The pair of anguish worked in secret. The Iron Maiden waited behind doors, but the wheel, it stood in the open, and its pain was made to be seen. The breaking wheel stood tall, visible to all. Its message was loud, its cruelty open. But now we move to something quieter. Not a device to break bones or shed blood, but to stretch time itself, a tool of exhaustion, of quiet torment. It did not shout, it whispered, and in its whisper it took away peace. This was the heretic's fork. At first glance it seemed simple. Two small metal rods sharp at each end, joined by a strap or belt, nothing more than steel and leather. But its strength wasn't in size, it was in design. One end of the fork was pressed beneath the chin, the other against the upper chest, or sometimes just under the jaw, pointing upward. The head was locked in place, no movement allowed. It didn't tear, it didn't cut deep, but it waited. The person wearing it could not lower their head, they couldn't speak, couldn't rest it gently on their chest. Even the smallest nod, just the natural pull of sleep, meant sharp metal would dig in, and that was the point. It wasn't made to kill the body. It was made to kill comfort. Those who wore it were often accused of heresy, of challenging faith or belief. Their punishment was not to be burned or broken, at least not yet, but to be watched, to be worn down slowly, 1 hour at a time. Sometimes the fork was attached to both the chest and the neck, sometimes even between the throat and the collarbone. The prongs varied in length and sharpness, but their goal stayed the same. no rest, no release, no relief. The fork forced the wearer into stillness, a stillness that over time became torture. Imagine standing or sitting for hours, days, without being able to slump, without closing your eyes and letting your head tilt, without falling into sleep even when your body begged for it. Every blink became heavier, every moment stretched longer, and yet sleep was forbidden, because the moment you gave in, the prongs would remind you painfully that you weren't allowed to rest. Guards sometimes stood close, watching. If the victim showed signs of falling asleep, they were struck, jerked awake, or worse, left to stab themselves with their own body's weakness. Sometimes a bell was hung near the fork. If it rang, the prisoner had moved, proof that they had failed to hold still, and with that sound came punishment. This device didn't work quickly. It didn't need to. The mind did most of the work. Over time, it unraveled itself. The lack of sleep caused confusion, fear, hallucinations. The soul grew thin. Some begged to confess, not because of pain, but because of time. Endless silent hours, days without sleep, nights without dreams, just the steady sting of metal and the echo of their own thoughts. The heretic's fork didn't need blood to be cruel. It was used mostly during the Inquisition, a time when silence could be dangerous, when questions were feared and belief had to be absolute. Those accused of spreading doubt, of speaking against the church, were often fitted with the fork. The logic was simple. If you couldn't sleep, you couldn't resist. If you couldn't rest, you would break. Gently, slowly, and in time many did. Even those who were innocent often confessed, just to end the silence, just to be allowed to lie down again. But not all who wore the fork were heretics. Sometimes it was used on political enemies, on those who questioned authority, on prisoners who refused to speak. Its shape was flexible, its meaning always clear. Control. And yet, the fork wasn't always fatal. Some survived, but the memories stayed. Sleeplessness cuts deep, and for those who wore it, the damage wasn't always visible on the skin. It was felt inside, in the corners of the mind, in the way silence never felt peaceful again. Today you might see the heretic's fork behind glass, in a museum, dull with age, quiet, but even now it carries a strange weight, because we understand its power, not through violence, but through stillness, because pain doesn't always scream, sometimes it just waits. And in that waiting, it reshapes a person. From the open cruelty of the breaking wheel to the quiet torment of the fork, the methods of punishment evolved, but the message remained the same: obey or suffer. We now leave the fork behind, still sharp, still waiting in the dark corners of memory, and next we'll step into something even more symbolic, a device that combined fire, fear, and metal, shaped like a beast, a bull, but not one that moved, one that burned. We left behind the burning silence of the brazen bull, a statue of fire and metal, where screams were shaped into song. Now we move somewhere quieter, smaller, simpler. No large iron chambers, no sculpted beasts, just a rat, a bucket, and heat. This was a different kind of horror, one that didn't come from weapons forged by man, but from instincts buried deep in nature. Rat torture wasn't about steel or sound. It didn't take place in grand public squares. Often it happened in shadows, dungeons, basements, locked rooms where only one light flickered. The setup was basic. A metal container, usually a bucket or pot, was placed on the bare stomach or chest of the victim. Inside the bucket, a single rat, alive, trapped. The opening of the bucket faced the victim's skin. Then came the fire. Hot coals, burning sticks, or even embers from a nearby brazier were pressed to the back of the bucket, slowly, carefully, until the metal grew warm, and then hotter. The rat felt it first, the rising heat, the tightening space. At first it scratched, then it panicked. The creature had only one direction to go, away from the heat, and the only escape was down, into the flesh, through it. That was when fear changed. The victim's pain didn't start with fire, it started with teeth. The rat began to dig, clawing, biting, burrowing into the soft skin beneath the bucket. The body's natural defense, the skin, was no match for the raw panic of an animal fighting for its life. And that's where this method became something more than just torture. It turned nature itself against the human body. People are not used to being prey, but in that moment, under the bucket, under the fire, they became just that, an obstacle for a desperate creature. The pain wasn't sharp at first, just pressure, then tearing, then burning as the rat moved deeper, following instinct, not cruelty. The torturer never had to lift a hand. Just wait. It didn't always end in death. Sometimes the torture was stopped partway through, enough to scar, to terrify, to leave behind a memory that would never fade. For others, the rat went too far. The body could not survive what came next. There were no rules. That's what made it so terrifying. This form of torture didn't need a courtroom. It didn't need approval. It only needed heat and fear. Some stories say this method was used during the Middle Ages. Others place it in the dungeons of corrupt officials, where threats had to feel personal. The idea wasn't just to cause pain, it was to remove control. The victim didn't fight a soldier or guard. They fought a panicked animal, unstoppable, uncaring. That helplessness was the real weapon. And the rat, unknowingly, became part of something much larger than itself. The choice of a rat wasn't random. Rats are survivors. They adapt. They chew through walls, wood, even bone. In cities, they live close to humans. In fear, they become unstoppable. To use one in this way was symbolic. Nature being twisted, life turned on itself. Those who designed such torments understood one thing clearly. The mind can be broken not only by pain, but by the fear of the unknown. A sword you can see, a flame you can feel. But what do you do when something is inside you and you can't stop it? That's the power of the rat. Some accounts describe the victim tied to a chair, arms and legs bound, eyes wide with dread. Others say the bucket was strapped tightly so no motion could loosen it, no scream could stop it. And all the while the rat scratched downward until warmth became flesh and fear became agony. This wasn't a tool used for justice. It was used for confession, for punishment, for revenge. And perhaps most chilling of all, it didn't require much. A bucket, a flame, a rat. That simplicity made it even more disturbing, because it reminded everyone that terror doesn't always need armor or chains. Sometimes it comes in fur, with tiny claws, acting only to survive. As with many tortures from the past, the records are not always clear. Some say it was rare. Others say it was whispered about, feared, more as a threat than a reality. But the idea of it, just the idea, was enough. Even centuries later, the image remains, not just for what it did, but for what it showed, that the line between man and beast can blur. That fear can be found in the smallest places, and that cruelty doesn't always roar. Sometimes it squeaks. We leave the bucket behind now, its fire cooled, its silence restored. But the echoes of scratching paws remain. Next, we move to something colder, something metal, with sharp curves and terrible purpose. A chair, but not for rest, for punishment. The iron chair awaits. We left behind the rat and the fire. We left the scratching, the fear, and the quiet violence of instinct turned against the human body. Now, we enter another kind of silence. This time, there are no flames, no animals, no sharp blades, only wood and gravity. It was called the Judas Cradle, a strange name for something so cruel. From a distance it might look harmless, just a wooden pyramid, smooth, pointed, carefully crafted. Its shape was simple, its size about as tall as a chair, but this was no place to sit. This was not furniture, this was humiliation, turned into punishment. Here's how it worked. A person was brought in, often bound, sometimes naked, usually already broken in spirit. They were suspended above the sharp point of the pyramid. Ropes were tied to their wrists and ankles. Sometimes weights were added to their feet. Then they were slowly lowered, not dropped, not forced, lowered. The tip of the wooden pyramid pressed into a very private, very sensitive place on the body, and there it stayed. At first, the pain was manageable, just pressure, discomfort. But with time, the real torture began. The entire body's weight rested on that single point. Muscles stretched, skin tore, and the person could do nothing to shift, to escape, to breathe freely. It wasn't loud. There were no screams that echoed for miles, no crowd, no fire, only slow, personal pain, and worse, shame. The Judas Cradle was used not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Victims were exposed. They were stripped of privacy, of dignity, watched closely, judged, reduced to something less than human. And that's what made this method so deeply disturbing, because the physical pain was only part of it. The real punishment lived in the silence, in the stillness, in the waiting. Some victims were kept on the cradle for hours, others for days. No quick end, no mercy. The body fought against the weight. The muscles burned, the mind begged for rest, but rest never came. This was a torture of patience, of gravity, of time. Some say the cradle was cleaned between victims, others say it was left stained on purpose to add fear before the pain even began. There's no need to imagine sharp blades or burning irons here, just the quiet cruelty of pressure, of the body turning against itself. And yet the Judas Cradle was designed with care, not as a tool of execution, but of warning. It didn't always kill, but it always left something behind. Bruises, tears, scars both seen and unseen. The message was clear: step out of line, and gravity would remind you. It's hard to know how often it was used. Records from the time are limited, but whispers of it can be found in old drawings and descriptions, each one more chilling than the last. And what makes it worse is that it felt almost surgical. It didn't rely on rage or chaos. It was calm, controlled, almost calculated. The torturer didn't shout, they didn't rush, they simply watched, waited, and lowered, 1 inch at a time. In that way, it was different from the rack or the wheel or the bull. It didn't crush the bones, it didn't burn the skin, but it broke something deeper. The Judas Cradle reminded its victims and its witnesses that pain doesn't always need to roar, sometimes it just needs time. And while other tortures aimed to destroy, this one aimed to erase identity, to reduce a person to nothing but discomfort and silence. Those who survived often never spoke of it, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. The shame was as deep as the pain itself. And so, like many tools of its kind, the cradle became more than an object. It became a symbol. A warning passed quietly from generation to generation. Not loud, but unforgettable. We leave it now. The pointed wood, the suspended figure, the steady rope. We leave the cradle just as it was left back then, standing quietly, waiting for the next name to be whispered into the dark. But we don't stay, because the next chamber holds something colder, heavier, sharper, a device that turned a common seat into a prison of metal. Next, we meet the iron chair, a seat of steel, studded, waiting. We left behind the Judas Cradle, its pointed wood, its silent cruelty, and its slow sinking weight. That torture was large, painful, and humiliating. But now we move to something much smaller, quiet, personal, precise. It doesn't take a large machine to cause fear. Sometimes pain lives in the tiniest places. In this chapter we meet such a tool. It was called the thumbscrew, simple in design, easy to carry, and absolutely terrifying. Made of metal, cold, tight and heavy, the thumbscrew looked like a clamp or a small vice, but its size was misleading, because what it lacked in size it made up for in pressure. The victim's thumb, or sometimes fingers, would be placed carefully inside its jaws. Then the screw would turn. One twist at a time. At first there was discomfort, a tight squeeze, a strange growing pressure. Then came the sharp pain, bone pressing against metal, skin stretching, fingernails bending in ways they shouldn't. With each turn of the screw, the bones had less space. They were trapped, forced inward, until, without warning, the first crack came. But it didn't stop there. One crack, then another, until the fingers, so delicate, so used to writing, creating, working, were nothing but broken pieces, flattened and crushed. And all of it happened in silence. The beauty, or the horror, of the thumbscrew was how quiet it was. There were no flames, no ropes, no crowds, just metal and patience. And unlike other tortures, this one had a specific purpose. Confession. The torturer didn't need to shout or beat, they just had to keep turning. If the victim stayed quiet, the pain continued. But if they spoke, if they gave a name, a secret, a truth, the turning stopped. At least, sometimes. Because, as we know, truth in those days was whatever the torturer wanted to hear. The thumbscrew didn't need time. It didn't need a room full of tools. It only needed one hand and one victim, and that made it perfect. It was portable, easy to hide, often used by interrogators, guards, and even priests. It could be carried from town to town, used in prisons or private chambers. And what made it even more terrible is that there was no blood, no mess. Just the soft sound of a screw turning and the quiet sound of bones breaking. There were different versions too. Some thumbscrews had spikes inside to pierce the skin as they crushed. Others were large enough to fit toes or the entire hand. Some were heated before use. The hot metal added an extra layer of agony. No extra pressure was needed, just the feeling of burning steel touching bone. And in many cases the torturer wouldn't look angry. They wouldn't raise their voice. They would simply ask questions and turn the screw again and again. What made the thumbscrew so cruel was that it felt personal, intimate. Pain in a place we all understand, fingers. We use our fingers for everything, to write, to eat, to hold the hand of someone we love. And now, that same hand was being turned into something unrecognizable. It's said that some people confessed within minutes, others took hours. Some passed out from the pain, others watched, awake, as their own fingers folded beneath metal, and even if the pain ended, the damage did not. Crushed bones often healed poorly, if at all. Fingers became crooked, stiff, useless. Some victims lost the ability to write, to feed themselves, to hold anything ever again. A small tool, that left a large shadow. That was the true power of the thumbscrew, not just the pain it caused, but the silence that came after, the kind of silence only a crushed hand can understand. So as we leave the small room where it was used, we remember not all torture had to be loud, not all devices had to be big. Sometimes the worst pain lives in small, dark corners, and as the screw tightens, so does the fear. We step away now, leaving behind the cracked fingers, the broken trust, and the twisted truth. Because ahead lies something colder still, a cage, a mask, a punishment for the face itself. Next, we meet the scold's bridle, a punishment not for the body, but for the voice. We left the cold, tight pressure of the thumbscrew behind, the silence, the breaking of bones, the stillness of the room. Now we step outside. But this is not freedom. This is another kind of prison, not a room, not a dungeon, but a cage, hanging in the open air. It was called the coffin cage, and it was exactly what it sounded like, an iron structure shaped like a man's body, thin, cramped, just big enough to fit a person inside. Once placed within it, the victim could not sit, could not lie down, could barely move. The arms stuck out through the bars, the legs hung low, the neck tilted, unable to rest. And then the cage was lifted, hung high on a post or a tower, visible to everyone. No shade, no cover, just metal and the sky. This punishment wasn't about sudden pain. It wasn't about breaking bones or tearing skin. It was about time, because inside that small metal shell, time became your enemy. Day turned to night. The air changed. Wind pushed against the skin. Rain soaked through clothes. The sun burned the face, and there was no escape. Birds came first, curious, slow, then insects, then hunger. The body grew weak, legs swelled, arms trembled, skin broke down, and above all, the people watched. The cage was meant to be seen. That was its purpose. Not just to punish one person, but to send a message to the rest. Step out of line, and this could be you. Sometimes the person was already dead, hanged or executed first, then placed in the cage. Their bodies slowly rotted under the sky in full view of the town. Other times, the person was very much alive, placed in the cage as a final judgment. They were left to starve, to thirst, to wait. And waiting was the cruelest part. Some lasted a day, others lasted several. There was no peace, no privacy, no comfort, just eyes, watching, judging. The cage became their world, iron became their bed, the sky their ceiling, and, to the animals, the birds especially, became visitors. Picking, pulling, waiting for flesh to soften. Some called it justice, others called it spectacle. For those watching, it was a warning. For those inside, it was a slow goodbye. What made the coffin cage unique was its shape. It hugged the body like a second skin. It followed the form from head to toe, and yet it allowed no comfort, no relief. It didn't need fire or spikes or whips, only time and exposure. And perhaps worst of all was the shame. There was no place to hide your pain, no place to cry, no place to be alone. Your final hours, or even days, became a public display. Some cages hung by roadsides, others near castle gates, or by the sea, where wind never stopped. People passed by, some laughed, others prayed, a few wept, but the one in the cage could do nothing but hang. Bones slowly shifted, skin turned pale, the body grew still, and finally it ended. But the cage remained, iron rusted, chains squeaked in the wind, and the memory stayed. It's hard to say how many people suffered in coffin cages. Records are few, many names have been forgotten, but the image remains clear. A figure in the sky, arms out, head low, motionless, except for the wind. And this was not centuries ago, in dark castles or forgotten lands. This was real, common, seen. A punishment not for what you did, but for what others were afraid to do. The coffin cage taught people fear through stillness. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it left a mark. A quiet death above a noisy world. And so we leave that image behind now. We step away from the shadow of the cage, the creaking chains, the birds in flight. Because just ahead, there is another kind of silence. Not hanging in the air, but locked on the face. A device that took away voice, breath, and dignity. Next, we meet the scold's bridle, where steel was not just punishment, but a muzzle for the mind. We left behind the silence of the cage, the still body hanging under the open sky. Time was the weapon there, but now we move into something more ancient, more primal. Heat. Not the heat of fire or flame, but water, still, calm, then slowly rising in temperature. This chapter is not about sudden pain. It's about the slow build, the creeping sensation, the body adjusting until it no longer can. This was boiling alive, a method of torture used not for its speed, but for its cruel patience. There were no sharp edges, no ropes, no cages, only a pot, a vat, or even a large cauldron, and water, or sometimes oil or tar. At first, the water was warm, almost comforting. The skin would not panic. Muscles stayed relaxed. Some may have even hoped it wouldn't go further. But it always did. The pot was heated from below, slowly, steadily. The victim, tied down, couldn't escape. And as the minutes passed, the warmth turned to heat, and the heat turned to pain. First it burned the surface, flesh pinked and blistered. Then, deeper. Boiling did not tear the body open. It didn't shatter bones or cut the skin. Instead, it cooked, muscle by muscle, layer by layer, and the body fought to survive. Sweat poured out, breath quickened, but the water surrounded everything. There was no escape, no cool air, no relief. The worst part? It was slow. Unlike fire, which consumes quickly, boiling took time. The water didn't rush. It waited. And in that waiting came the agony. The body would begin to fail in pieces. Nerve endings screamed, skin peeled, eyes rolled back. But still, the victim remained conscious. Longer than one might think. Sometimes they were only submerged waist deep. The lower half of the body cooked while the top remained dry, watching, feeling. Others were completely immersed, held under with chains. It depended on the message the torturer wanted to send, because this wasn't just about killing. It was about control, spectacle, fear. In medieval Europe, boiling alive was often used for those who were seen as traitors, poisoners, or enemies of the crown. It wasn't always done in secret. Sometimes the pot was placed in public squares. People gathered. They watched the steam rise. They saw the skin turn red, then grey, then black, and the message was clear. This is what happens when you go too far. The executioner didn't swing a blade. He didn't fire an arrow. He just waited and stirred. That's all it took. One fire, one pot, and time. Some records say that oil was used instead of water. It burned quicker, deeper, but even so the process remained slow, and the victim had no voice. Once inside, all that remained was the sound of boiling, bubbling, the hiss of flesh meeting heat. Some tried to scream, others went silent, some fainted early, and some didn't. There was no rule, no set time. Everybody responded differently. Some lasted minutes, others longer. And when it was over, the water told the story. A clouded surface, a dark ring, a silence that followed. There were other methods, of course, fire, iron, stone, but boiling was different. It required no blade, only patience, only heat, and the knowledge that once it began, there was no way to stop it. This method wasn't used often. It was too slow, too horrific, even for the time. But when it was chosen, it was remembered. The pot stayed behind long after the body was gone. Cold again, still, waiting. And so we come to the end. 10 chapters, 10 devices, 10 glimpses into a world shaped by pain, control, and fear, but also by silence. Each method we've explored didn't just hurt the body. They changed how people behaved, how they spoke, how they walked, how they obeyed. Torture wasn't always about punishment. It was about shaping the world through fear. And in every tool, every screw, every flame, there was a story. Not just of the one who suffered, but of the one who watched, and the one who ordered it. Now, as the last pot cools and the fire goes out, we step back, away from the cages. Away from the wheels and racks. Away from the cries that once echoed through stone halls. Because though these methods are no longer used, their shadows remain. In museums, in books, in the stories we tell, to remember how far we've come, and how far we could still fall. Sleep now, let the stories settle, and may the silence that follows be gentler than the ones before. The fire is out now. The water has gone still. The last sound has faded into silence. But something remains. Not the tools, not the rooms, not even the pain. What remains is memory. You've walked through 10 chapters, 10 stories shaped by wood, iron, fire, and fear. Devices made not just to harm, but to speak. Because that's what these things truly were. Messages. Messages written not with words, but with wounds. They were warnings. Whispers cast in metal. They said, "Stay quiet." They said, "Obey." And even now, centuries later, those whispers still echo. You've heard about the rack, the way it stretched without mercy. You remember the pear, how it opened in silence, deep inside. You saw the wheel, how it broke the body, one careful swing at a time. And the cradle, how pain could be slow without a scream. Each device was different, but the goal was the same. Control, not just over the body, but over thought, over belief, over truth. And that's what makes these stories so powerful. They are not only about cruelty, they are about power, power used in its darkest form. We often think of history in terms of kings, queens, wars, and empires. But this is another part, the quiet part, the part hidden in the corners of castles, behind thick doors, below the floors of ancient courts. It wasn't always loud. Most of the time, it was very, very quiet. Because real fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it only looks at you. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it smiles. The people who built these tools were skilled. They understood the human body, but more than that, they understood the human mind. They knew what scared us, and they used that fear like a scalpel, small, sharp, controlled. That's why so many of these tools weren't designed to kill immediately. They were made to last, to give pain time to grow, to let fear spread, because a scream lasts seconds, But a memory can lack, said a lifetime. And even now, centuries later, these memories survive. We find the tools in museums. We read the names in old texts. We see drawings in books, black ink on yellowed pages. But no one draws the silence that came after. No one sketches the look in someone's eyes when they were led into the room and saw what waited for them. No one records the moment right before, when they still had hope. That part is left to imagination, and maybe that's the part that stays with us the longest. Because in the end, these tools didn't survive because they were well made. They survived because people remembered them. Not as machines, but as warnings. Some say we study the past to learn from it, to avoid making the same mistakes. Maybe that's true. But sometimes we study the past because we feel it calling, because something in it speaks to us, not with words, but with feeling. A cold feeling, a heavy one, something deep in the chest. And tonight, as you close your eyes and let these stories drift into dreams, ask yourself, why were these tools made? And who were they made for? The answer is not always who we expect. Sometimes the tools weren't made for the guilty. Sometimes they were used on those who simply didn't fit in, the different, the defiant, the ones who said no when they were supposed to say yes. And that's perhaps the darkest part, because it tells us this, that pain can be given a purpose, that cruelty can be dressed in law, that silence can be forced. But here in this moment, you are safe. These are only echoes now, cold iron left behind in the dust of history. They cannot reach you, they cannot touch you, they cannot hurt you. They are just stories. Still, they are worth remembering, because forgetting them, that is how they return. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, carry this thought gently with you. The scariest part of history is not the screaming, it's the quiet, it's the waiting, it's the sound of metal cooling after use, because that's where power hides, not in fire, not in chains, but in the silence that follows. That is the sound of control, and that is what we must never allow to return. Sleep well, let your breath slow. The stories are over now, the iron is cold, the doors are closed, and the whispers are finally quiet.